And now here is Dennis Murray. Good day to you. God bless you. Welcome to Shepherd's Chapel. Welcome to this family Bible study hour. We're getting ready to have an old-fashioned Bible study here at the chapel. We invite you to pull out your Bible and join us. Won't you do that? In our last lecture, we saw that Solomon, after the temple was completed, which took approximately 7.5 years to complete, and of course there was still work to be done, as we'll see in the lecture today, but basically the external and the interior of the temple was finished, and after that he began construction on his own palace network, I'll call it, which included the house of the Forest of Lebanon, the Porch of Pillars, the Hall of Judgment, or the throne room, if you will, the place that Solomon himself dwelt, and also his wife, the daughter of Pharaoh's house, was built all in that one king's palace area, if you will. That took 13 years, so again, we were halfway through Solomon's reign of 40 years by the time the construction had been finished. When in our last lecture we had talked about the several buildings in the king's palace. The first several verses that we covered today will complete that, and then we'll be getting into the bronze metallic things that were built for the courtyard of the temple, the inner court, if you will. So with that, we'll ask a word of wisdom, as always, in Yeshua Jesus' precious name. Father, we ask you to open eyes, open ears today. We're going to pick it up today with 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 9, and it reads, all these, and again this is referring to the buildings of verses 2 through 8, the king's palace area, were of costly stones, not costly stones in the form of jewelry or precious stones as you might consider, but they were costly because of their gigantic size. Costly to quarry, costly to transport. A lot of these stones, well, we'll get a description of one here in a moment. According to the measures of hewed stones, or cut stones, if you will, sawed with saws, within and without, even from the foundation unto the coping being the corbels, if you, it's an architectural term on which the beams of the roof rest, and so on, the outside toward the great court. In other words, surrounding the great court surrounded the great halls, if you will, the buildings that we've been talking about. And this sawed within and without simply means that the stones were finished on the inside and the outside, giving a much nicer appearance. Verse 10, and the foundation was of costly stones, even great stones, stones of 10 cubits and stones of 8 cubits. And if we went with a measure of 24 inches to a cubit, we would see that some of these stones would be from 16 to 20 feet in length. And the thickness is not stated, but I'm sure they were quite thick, and that these stones actually form the foundation of the building, and you would want that to be very solid, and when you start building on top of that with more gigantic stones. And the foundation was, we did that, okay, verse 11. And above, in other words, above the foundation, which we just discussed, were costly stones after the measures of hewed stones and cedars. Walls of this time would be very, very thick. Estimates probably of 4 to 6 feet at the beginning or at the floor level of these particular buildings would not be overstated. Verse 12, and the great court round about was with 3 rows of hewed stones, and a row of cedar beams, both for the inner court of the house of the Lord and for the porch of the house. In other words, this was just like the court, the way they did it with the 3 rows of stone and 1 row of cedar beams in the inner court of the house of the Lord, the temple. They also did in this porch area. 13. And King Solomon, now in verses 13 through 51, will be getting into the bronze items or brass items that were made for the temple court. And King Solomon sent and fetched Hiram out of Tyre. And you'll recall that it was King Hiram of Tyre, or Hiram king of Tyre, that Solomon made the league with for, or a covenant, if you will, a contract for all the cedar that would be needed to build these particular buildings. Now this is another Hiram. He has the same name as the king. In 2 Chronicles chapter 2, verse 13, he's actually called Huram, H-U-R-A-M, and he's also called my father's there. And he wasn't anybody's father, but father is also an honorary title that actually means counselor or master. In other words, Hiram was a master craftsman, and when we see the items that he was able to produce, you'll see what I mean. I like to compare Hiram with the tabernacle artificer, artist, if I may use that word, that being Bezaleel, who was provided to Moses and was responsible for creating a lot of the gold utensils, the golden candlestick, for example, of the original Mosaic tabernacle. But here we have Hiram being sent out of Tyre. Let's learn a little more about him. Verse 14. He was a widow's son of the tribe of Naphtali. And in 2 Chronicles 2:14, she was actually, that would be by marriage, she was of Naphtali, but by birth, his mother was of Dan, the tribe of Dan. In other words, she was born in the tribe of Dan, married a man of Naphtali. He passed away, and therefore she, being a widow, was free, of course, to marry the man from Tyre, which she did. And his father was a man of Tyre, a worker in brass, and he was filled with wisdom. Back in Exodus, Bezaleel, who was the artist in the Mosaic tabernacle, was filled with the Spirit of God, it's stated. But here we see Hiram filled with wisdom and understanding and cunning to work all works in brass. And in other words, cunning being he was skillful or a specialist. And he could also work in gold and silver and other metals, but bronze or brass is stated here because that's about what we're to see about to be created in this chapter. And he came to King Solomon and wrought all his work. And he probably brought along quite a few assistants as well. Hiram, no doubt, played more the part of a designer and a superintendent over the workers, because there was indeed a lot of, when you consider what all we had already studied on the interior of the Holy of Holies and in the holy place, with all the intricate carvings of the cherubims and the palm trees. No doubt he had quite a workforce that came with him, also skilled understudies, if you will, of Hiram. Verse 15, for he cast, this means that he fashioned, if you will, 2 pillars of brass of 18 cubits high apiece, and a line of 12 cubits did compass either of them about. In other words, they were identical. And this 18 cubits, that wasn't the total height, that was just the pillar itself, for we will see in a moment that there were crowns placed on top of the pillars. But the pillar portion itself, if we use our old rule of average of 24 inches per cubit, about 36 feet in height. Now in Jeremiah chapter 52:21, we learn a little more about the pillars than what's stated here or in Chronicles, and that is that they were hollow and that they were a handbreadth or 4 fingers in thickness. The walls of them, in other words. Verse 16. And he made 2 capiters. Here we are with our crowns or capitals, these made to sit on top of each of the pillars, of molten brass, to set upon the tops of the pillars. The height of one capiter was 5 cubits, and the height of the other capiter was 5 cubits. So of course, they were identical, in other words. And then, therefore, with the pillar being 18 cubits and the capital or crown being 5 cubits, we have a total of 23 cubits, or approximately 46 feet in height. And continues on about the capitals and the pillars in verse 17. And nets of checker work, I think probably better translated lattice work, you could think of it. In other words, interwoven. And wreaths of chain work, in other words, ornaments. They were highly ornate for the capiters which were upon the top of the pillars, 7 for the one capiter and 7 for the other capiter. And of course, you can take a lot to this particular chapter with biblical numerics. If we back up to the 18 cubits for the height of the pillar, most of you know that that's bondage. The pillars would be placed on the porch, as we will see in a moment, in front of the temple. And much like Paul would write in the New Testament, I'm in chains of service to the Lord. And we should be in bondage as we serve Yahweh, in bondage to Him, no one else, of course. Then you've got the capital, which is 5 cubits. What is 5 in biblical numerics? Most of you know it means grace. We have 2 pillars, always symbolic of the Father and the Son. Verse 18. And he made the pillars in 2 rows round about upon the one network, the lattice work, in other words, to cover or crown the capiters that were upon the top with pomegranates. And so did he for the other capiter. And there will be 200 pomegranates made for each of these capitals or capiters. The pomegranate being a many-seeded fruit, and many seeds, of course, symbolic of life. Verse 19. And the capiters that were upon the top of the pillars were of lily work in the porch, 4 cubits. And what do we have here? Well, every time I think of lily, I think of Song of Solomon, chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, where Christ is the lily of the valley. So here we have the lily work on the capital or the crown, and Christ obviously is the head. He is the crown. Verse 20. And the capiters upon the 2 pillars had pomegranates also above, over against the belly, which was by the network or the lattice work, and the pomegranates were 200 in rows round about upon the other capiter. And again, 2, always the Father and the Son. 21. And he set up the pillars in the porch of the temple, and he set up the right pillar and called the name thereof Jachin. And he set up the left pillar and called the name thereof Boaz. Jachin means he shall establish. Boaz means in him is strength. Couldn't help but when I think of the pillars of the temple, my mind races to Revelation chapter 3. And in verse 12 there, Christ speaking, he states that he that overcometh will I make a pillar in the temple of my God. You know, that's quite an honor for Christ to say. And of course, what Christ is meaning there and what he's saying there in Revelation chapter 3 is those that overcome the temptation of Antichrist. That's how much he thinks of those, the elect, that are willing to stand and testify with the Holy Spirit testifying through them and standing for the true Messiah. He will make them pillars in the temple. 22. And upon the top of the pillars was lily work. So was the work of the pillars finished. Truly magnificent examples of work. I think it's difficult for us to imagine how beautiful this temple would have been. You know, God designed it himself. He wrote the design on David, and David passed it on to his son Solomon. Now we come to the brazen sea, one of the few items that we did not see in the Mosaic temple. But again, I think that's probably due to the fact that the Mosaic tabernacle was a tent. It was made for a nomadic peoples to be moved from point to point. It would have been very difficult for, I don't care how many priests you had together, to carry this molten sea. And filling it with water wouldn't have been an easy thing in the desert either, as we'll see as we work our way through this. Verse 23, and he made a molten sea, and this is sometimes referred to as the brazen sea, in other words, made of brass or bronze, 10 cubits from the one brim to the other, approximately 20 feet in diameter. It was round all about, and his height was 5 cubits, approximately 10 feet in height. And a line of 30 cubits did compass it round about. The circumference, 30 cubits, that would be approximately 60 feet in circumference. We're talking about a small family-sized swimming pool here. And under the brim of it, round about, there were knops. And these knops, remind you, are decorative gourds. In fact, in 2 Chronicles chapter 4, verse 3, it states that there were oxen engraved around. And it's a copyist error there, and the knops or gourds are correct here. Compassing it 10 in a cubit. In other words, every cubit, there were 10 of these decorative gourds. Compassing the sea round about, the knops were cast in 2 rows when it was cast. In other words, they were poured at the same time that the laver, or the brazen sea, was poured. They were also engraved or etched, and we'll see when we get to verse 46 that these articles were cast in the plain of Jordan, where the soil is very much of a clay content. So what they would do basically is carve out in the clay what it was, whatever it was they were making. In a moment we'll get to several other items, but in the case of the brazen sea, they actually dug out this size of a hole in the ground, and then in the clay would engrave the gourds and the other items that decorated it, and then melted the material, the bronze, and poured it into it. And that's how it was made at the time. Hiram obviously being very skilled at what he did. Verse 25, it, this being the brazen sea, the brazen laver, stood upon 12 oxen, 1 for each of the tribes of Israel, 3 looking toward the north, and 3 looking toward the west, and 3 looking toward the south, and 3 looking toward the east. And the sea was set above upon them, and all their hinder parts were inward. In other words, the oxen were all facing 4 different directions, but facing out. I think symbolizing facing the 4 corners of the earth and heaven as well. And the purpose of this brazen sea was for the priests to wash themselves. In other words, I think the oxen and the brazen sea were making the symbolic statement of Israel, represented by the 12 oxen, cleanse yourself here through the priest always being the mediators between God and the people of Israel. Now, whenever I think of the 3 tribes on north, south, east, and west, I can't help but think back in Numbers chapter 2. You'll recall when Israel was a nomadic nation moving from one point to the other, when they encamped at night, there was a set procedure. God had this all lined out, very organized, and there were 3 tribes that faced the north. In other words, they protected the north, 3 the east, 3 the west, and 3 the south, the 12 tribes. And of course, when they broke camp, they set forth in an organized manner as well. Always the same 3 tribes in different positions, heading up or taking up the rearward, protecting from rear attack. Verse 26, and it was an handbreadth thick. Here we have the 4 fingers, if you will, as we saw, as I mentioned a moment ago, on the measurement of the thickness of the pillars, also being 4 fingers thick. And the brim thereof was wrought like a brim of a cup. In other words, it bent outwards like a coffee cup, a teacup you might think of. And flowers of lilies, ornamented also. It contained 2,000 baths. This being liquid measure. Those of you with companion Bibles, you can check Appendix 51, and 1 bath equals 6 English gallons. So again, approximately 12,000 gallons, which is equivalent to what a small family pool would hold of water. That would be a lot of water to come up with in the desert as the nomadic peoples were moving around. Now in 2 Chronicles chapter 4, verse 5, it states that there were 3,000 baths that were contained by this brazen sea. However, there I think it means that the total capacity, and of course they wouldn't fill it completely up, would be wasteful. Verse 27, and he made 10 bases of brass. 4 cubits was the length of one base, and 4 cubits the breadth thereof, and 3 cubits the height of it. Now, this would be, of course, what we're going to be getting to here are the chests, if you will, or the cases that would hold the 10 lavers that will be created in the following verses after this. So what we're reading here is a description of the 10 bases. Now 10 would be quite a few, but I think that also lets us know that the number of sacrifices being made at the time was growing up considerably. Now what these cases would hold a large laver, which is a large pan, if you will, which would hold, I think it was, we'll see here in a moment, but it's several baths of water itself. But what the priest would do upon, there was a set order that the priest or whoever was preparing the sacrifice, in some cases it was the actual person making the sacrifice, depending on the type of offering it was, or usually the priest. But there was a set order of preparing the sacrifice for a burnt offering, and obviously it would be about like a butcher shop, if you will. So what these stands and lavers would be used for is, as the priest was preparing the sacrifice to burn on the burnt offering, they would wash the different parts that were to be laid on the altar in a particular order, as well as the fat, which is always offered to the Lord. More about the bases, verse 28. And the work of the bases was on this manner. They had borders, and the borders were between the ledges. These borders are panels or enclosures, if you will, and the ledges are spacers. And as we'll see in a moment, the bases themselves were square. In fact, as we read in verse 27 that they were 4 cubits wide and 4 cubits long as well, so forming a square, obviously. Verse 9, and on the borders that were between the ledges were lions, oxen, and cherubims. And upon the ledges there was a base above, and beneath the lions and oxen were certain additions made of thin work. And this additions probably being connections, probably wreath work, if you will, very ornate. And you know, we saw the cherubims and palm trees appearing a lot in the artwork inside of the holy place and also the Holy of Holies. Here we throw in the lions and the oxen, which didn't appear inside the temple, but anytime that this decoration was made on them, there was a purpose, because God is the one that designed it, but also I think it set these articles aside for temple worship and temple use only. Verse 30, and every base had 4 brazen wheels. In other words, they were movable, and with that much water there would be a considerable amount of weight, so having the wheels on them would be beneficial. And plates of brass, and the 4 corners thereof had undersetters. You could think of these as projections or legs that were attached to the axles. Under the laver were undersetters molten at the side of every addition. In other words, the stand or the chest was on wheels to where they could move it from point to point. No doubt when they were getting ready to sacrifice, as we'll see, these were located closer to the temple, but then they could bring them closer to the priest next to the altar of burnt offering so that they could use it to wash the sacrifices before burning. And they sat on these supports that were attached to the axles rather than just staying on the wheels themselves. Verse 31, and the mouth of it within the catheter, or the crown, and above was a cubit, but the mouth thereof was round after the work of the base, a cubit and a half. And also upon the mouth of it were gravings with their borders, or panels, 4 square, not round. In other words, the base was square, not round. And of course, the lavers will be round and sit inside of these chests. These chests and the lavers and the brazen sea, as it's written in 2 Kings chapter 16, verse 17, which we'll get to, were removed by Ahaz, who was a particularly evil king of Judah, and he closed the doors of the temple, but Hezekiah restored it. 32, and under the borders were 4 wheels, and the axle trees of the wheels were joined to the base, and the height of a wheel was a cubit and a half cubit. 33, and the work of the wheels was like the work of a chariot wheel, much like that of a chariot wheel. Their axle trees, and this is meaning, but unlike chariot wheels, the axle trees and their naves, this is to hollow or curve, and their felloes, which are the spokes, and their spokes were all molten, in other words, cast like the wheels. They were very much unlike chariot wheels would have been made at the time. 34, and there were 4 undersetters to the 4 corners of one base, and the undersetters, or supports or legs, were of the very base itself. Each laver was about, we'll see in a moment, 4 cubits in diameter. And it's thought that the outside lip formed out much like a shell, you would think, a large shell turned upside down, in other words. So they needed this support to support it and keep it from turning over. In other words, when you've got that much water in this case, and then you throw half a side of beef on there, or an ox for the sacrifice, you've got a lot of weight up there. 36, for on the plates of the ledges thereof, and on the borders thereof, he graved cherubims, lions, and palm trees, according to the proportion of every one, and additions round about. In other words, this to the proportion, meaning on a reduced scale, as the plates required. And again, this artistic work showing that this equipment or utensils, furniture, if you wish to call it, were set aside for service in the sanctuary. After this manner he made the 10 bases. All of them had 1 casting, 1 measure, and 1 size, all probably poured in the same mold, if you will, in the clay in the plain of Jordan. In other words, they were all, as much as possible, identical. Now we get to the lavers, or basins, that would sit on or in the chests, the bases that we just described. Verse 38, then made he 10 lavers of brass. 1 laver contained 40 baths, quite a few gallons of water in each one of these. And every laver was 4 cubits, in other words, in diameter, and upon every one of the 10 bases 1 laver. 39, and he put 5 bases on the right side of the house. This would be the south side of the temple, and not on the side, but in the front of the temple, probably just before the porch. And 5 on the left side, being the north side of the temple, of the house, And he set the sea on the right side of the house eastward over against the south. In other words, the bases and the lavers being on wheels could be easily moved about. This brazen sea, that's another story. So the brazen sea was a little farther forward from the porch, probably a little closer to the altar of burnt offering than the bases and the smaller lavers were. The next verse, please. And that is 40. And Hiram made the lavers and the shovels would be utilized for removing ashes. And the basins, these are probably smaller pans, you might think of it, that were utilized to collect the blood of the sacrifices, and then the priest would sprinkle it, depending again on the type of sacrifice, either on the altar or on the ground around the altar. So Hiram made an end of doing all the work that he made King Solomon, better made for King Solomon, for the house of the Lord. And then the following verses we'll see a recap of the items that were made of brass. And again, that's for the courtyard. And remember when we were talking about the Holy of Holies and the holy place, which all inside the inner sanctuary, that was mostly all gold that we saw there. These are brass or bronze items, and we'll run through them quickly, and that it is a recap. Verse 41, the two pillars and the two bowls of the capiters, that being the crown or the capital, that were on top of the two pillars, and the two networks, this being the lattice work, to cover the two bowls of the capiters which were upon the top of the pillars. 42, and 400 pomegranates for the two networks, even 2 rows of pomegranates for one network, to cover the two bowls of the capiters that were upon the pillars, upon the face of the pillars, in other words, very ornate. And the 10 bases, or chests, and the 10 lavers on the bases, and 1 sea, and 12 oxen under the sea, and the pots and the shovels and the basins, all utensils used by the priest in their worship, and all these vessels which Hiram made to King Solomon for the house of the Lord were of bright brass. This means they were made bright, and is what it actually is in the Hebrew, which means that the metal was scoured to where it would shine quite brightly. 46, in the plain of Jordan did the king cast them, in the clay ground between Succoth and Zarthan. And again, it's saying, did the king cast them, but obviously he's getting credit for the work, and that it was he that was coordinating all this, but Hiram was the artist that did it, no doubt. 47, and Solomon left all the vessels unweighed, because they were exceeding many. Neither was the weight of the brass found out. In other words, this in the Hebrew means, was it searched? There was so much bronze utilized that nobody even thought to weigh it. And, you know, this metal that was used, the bronze and the gold also, a lot of this had been accumulated by David, Solomon's father. He took a lot of it from the cities of Hadadezer when one of the kings of Syria, part of Syria, king of Aramite state of Zobah, Tui, the king of Hamath, sent him a lot of gold, silver, and brass when he defeated Hadadezer, because he was also an enemy of Tui. So, but there was a lot of raw materials utilized in the building of the temple. And Solomon made all the vessels, again Hiram most likely, but Solomon getting the credit, that pertained unto the house of the Lord. And the altar of gold, this would be the altar of incense, and that it was gold-plated. And the table of gold, this being the table for the showbread, whereupon the showbread was. 49, and the candlesticks, in the Hebrew menorahs, of pure gold, 5 on the right side, and again we see that number for grace, and 5 on the left before the oracle, in other words, before the Holy of Holies. with the flowers and the lamps and the tongs of gold, just as it's described in Exodus chapter 25. I'm sure that the pattern of the menorah remained the same, although we have 10 of them here rather than 1. Verse 50, and the bowls and the snuffers and the basins and the spoons and the censers of pure gold, this would be a little higher quality gold, more valuable, and the hinges of gold, this probably a lesser quality gold, both for the doors of the inner house, the Holy of Holies, and the most holy place, that's the rest of the sanctuary, and for the doors of the house, to wit, of the temple. And all these snuffers, the candlesticks, you know, many today would probably think of it as a candle, like a wax candle with a wick, and that's thinking totally wrong. They had bowls on them, as they're called, which held oil, and the lamps actually burnt oil. And of course, that means you had to have a wick, and this required daily attention, and they would have to have tweezers and things of this nature to trim the wicks back, and to also, you know, just to get it ready so it would continue burning. And so all those materials listed there in verse 50, utensils, were utilized with the candlesticks, except for the gold, of course, for the hinges of the doors. And let's go ahead and finish this chapter, and we'll stop for today, this verse 51. So was ended all the work that King Solomon made for the house of the Lord. And Solomon brought in the things which David his father had dedicated. And I'll find a list of those in 2 Samuel 8:1. Even the silver and the gold and the vessels did he put among the treasures of the house of the Lord. And there were so many precious materials gathered by David that they had materials left over. And Solomon, of course, putting them in the treasure of the house of the Lord, whatever was left over. Well, when we come back in our next lecture, don't miss it, because all the work's done. 7.5 years in the making, the exterior and the interior, probably 3 years in addition to that for the making of all the utensils and the furniture of the temple. And when we come back in our next lecture, we get to dedicate the temple, and the temple will be occupied with the glory of the Lord, and it will be a joyous, joyous time for Israel, as we'll see in our next lecture. We've got a short message. We'll ask you to